So with the reboot of what you could call a relatively unsuccessful movie franchise in the late 90s that birthed an iconic movie that was a favourite amongst fans at the time, but went on to make more versions than what it needed to, I thought it was about time to revisit the original I Know What You Did Last Summer movie from almost 30 years ago, especially seeing as though the relaunch of this franchise was disregarding the I'll Always Know What You Did Last Summer movie. This slasher film from the late 1990s was based on the 1973 novel by Lois Duncan, and in terms of being a memorable slasher, it is exactly that. In my mind, the things that make a good slasher movie are jump scares, which this one has, gruesome deaths, which it also has, a group of characters that start to get killed off one by one, yup, a score which feels true to the genre, also yup, and a load of over-the-top dramatic screaming. Well, it definitely has that. With an ending that didn't actually get cleared up until the sequel. But don't worry, I'll give you the spoilers in this. Let's dive into this video and break down the original I Know What You Did Last Summer movie. Just to let you know, this video will contain spoilers. The importance of the opening scene. So this movie opens up with the song Summer Breeze being played, but the version by Typo Negative, who were a gothic doom metal band. I feel there are a few key reasons as to why this version was selected. The first is that it's obviously the 4th of July and the peak of summer for the characters. They're celebrating and enjoying the summer, so the song is fitting. But the genre and sound of the song is one which is quite dark, ominous, and it makes it seem like there's this doom and tragedy that's on the horizon, which is actually at the core of the film. As the song was playing, it was accompanied by a shot of the beach, the ocean, and the cliff, where not only do we hear about the legend called the Hook, which is the folklore killer that the actual killer in this movie resembled, but it also showed us the water where the body was dumped and the cliff and road where all of the chain of events started, where the group ultimately hit the man with their car. As the camera moved over the ocean, the sound of the waves crashing into the rocks got louder and louder, which symbolized the fact that something tragic was going to happen. But it wasn't the tragedy that we thought. It was more so the fact that David Egan, the person who the camera eventually cut to, who was up there mourning the death of his fiancée Susie Willis, who he was involved in a car accident with, but ended up surviving himself and she didn't. He was there to end things for himself. As we later found out, David Egan didn't end things for himself, nor was he the person that was hit by the car. It was Susie Willis's father that was hit by the car, and he was hit after he pushed David off the edge of the cliff and took the pendant that had the iconic clink to it. This was a great opening scene that set the backdrop for the tone of the movie well, but it also showed us the character that was perceived to be the killer, the road where the event started, and with us seeing David there, it allowed us to think that for the entirety of the movie, he was the person that they killed that fateful summer night. The beach scene that followed was also a really important inclusion. This had the four friends sitting around the fire talking about the folklore urban legend story of the Hook, who escaped from an asylum, had a hook for a hand and killed different victims in multiple different ways, leaving them hanging upside down and even gutted by the hook. Ben Willis used a hook as his weapon of choice, and we saw gutting taking place on the likes of the police officer, and we even saw animals being left hanging upside down with blood dripping throughout. Ben Willis even found himself hanging upside down during his demise, so this initial story was something that subtly hinted to what was on the horizon. We were explicitly told about the deranged killer with a hook for a hand, and we saw it playing out directly in front of us. Myth became a reality. There was also some subtle symbolism here too, with the fact that there was a scene where both Helen and Barry were behind the flames of the fire, which to me represented death, and those two obviously ended up dying. However, Ray and Julie were under the moonlight together, and they both ended up surviving, so I thought that was a nice touch. The ending explained. When it came to the ending of this movie, there were only two of the main characters that were left from the original four. Barry, the character who pretty much started the entire chain of events by acting like a drunk fool in the car, which caused Ray to get distracted and hit Ben, was killed when he went to watch Helen in the 4th of July parade when she was attending the pageant. He came face to face with the Hook for a second time and met his end. And we also saw that Helen met her end too after her sister was killed in their father's store. Her sister was a terrible human being and she was so mean to Helen, but I don't think she deserved to die because of that. When Julie went to visit David Egan's sister, Missy, for the second time, Missy said that David ended things for himself, and she knew that that was the case because he left her a note. A note which read, "I will never forget last summer." This could have been perceived as that type of note because that was obviously the day when he was driving the car that killed the person that he loved most in the world, and guilt was running through his bones. This note was actually in the same handwriting as the letters that the group had received, the ones which read, "I know what you did last summer," and that's where the dots all clicked inside of Julie's mind. She realized that David was actually killed by the same person that was after them, and that was the person that they hit with the car. After doing some research, she realized that it was Susie's father, Ben Willis, the person that was left mourning the daughter that he lost. The entire town, including him, blamed David for Susie's death, and one would have to assume that David might have been drink driving, and that's why there was that resentment that was felt towards him. Ben Willis was actually up on the cliffside, and that's why he was hit that night. He was up there because he'd just disposed of David Egan's body, and it was where he pushed him off the cliff, as that was the last place that we saw David. Ben even took the medallion that said, "I love you." So the person that the group hit and thought that they killed and ultimately disposed of, Ben Willis, wasn't actually dead. He didn't die when he was in the water, and he managed to escape after they left. This ultimately led to the climax, all taking place on the boat that was owned by Ben Willis, which was named after his daughter, Sweet Susie. It was on the boat where there were articles that were scattered around about Susie's death, and he'd been researching information about Helen, Julie, Ray, and Barry, showing how he was still mourning his daughter, but at the same time, he was fueled by revenge to kill the very people that thought that they killed him and wanted to get away with it. With Ray riding his speedboat over to Sweet Susie where the final hunt was taking place between Ben and Julie, Ray got knocked off into the fishing net by Ben when he tried to fight him. However, he climbed back up the net onto the boat, and then before Ben could kill Julie, a hook, which was rather fitting, hit Ben in the face and knocked him out. But there was obviously more to come, because as Ben said himself to Julie as a warning, when you leave a man for dead, make sure he's really dead. It took all of a few seconds for Julie to forget that rule, because Ben awoke, knocked Ray to the ground again, and as he went to slash Julie, his hand got caught in a rope, got raised up high, ended up losing his hand, and ultimately fell into the ocean, leading us to believe that he was dead. However, what's that rule again? Make sure he's really dead. And obviously, they couldn't do that. Julie and Ray ended up admitting their love for each other after Ray explained how he went to see Missy and how he was Billy Blue, the friend that Missy spoke about, and that he went there because he wanted to learn more about the person that they thought that they killed. But obviously, they didn't kill anybody that night because Ben Willis, who they actually hit, ended up surviving. During the final moments of the episode, we saw that it was 1 year later, and Julie was getting ready for another summer, and in 2 weeks' time she was going to be going to New York to be with Ray. However, after receiving a letter, she feared that it would be the return of the killer, as after all, Ben Willis was never found. This letter actually turned out to be an invite to a pool party, but when she returned to the room that was filled with steam and smoke, another repeated feature as we saw it when Barry was killed and also on the night where they hit Ben Willis with the car and were getting rid of the body, so it symbolized danger. The words, "I still know," were written on the cubicle glass, alluding to the fact that the killer was there. Before the movie ended, the final thing that we saw was a figure emerging from the shower and it implying that Julie was most likely killed. Now, if it was left there, it would have an ambiguous ending where we'd never know if she survived or if it was Ben that was back there for revenge. But it turned out that in the early parts of the sequel movie, I Still Know What You Did Last Summer, which was released a year later in 1998, that scene was in fact a dream and she didn't die. But I suppose for a year, people had to wonder. It's no surprise either really, as Jennifer Love Hewitt is cast in the movie that's releasing this year and it's set in the present day, so that scene definitely wasn't real. The kill count. I feel like it's wrong to not provide a kill count for a slasher movie when the deaths and the creativity of them are the focal point. Within this movie, we had David Egan, who was killed by Ben Willis, pushed off the cliff, drifted out to sea and then washed up a few weeks later. We had Max being killed by taking a hook to the neck and then being dragged around. There was the police officer that was killed by being gutted by the hook. There was Barry, who was absolutely butchered by the hook. Elsa, Helen's sister, was slashed with the hook. And then finally, we had Helen, who was killed by the hook in the alleyway whilst on the cusp of making it to freedom and the safety of the public. Of course, she had to turn around at the last moment. It wouldn't be a proper slasher if she didn't. So in total, there were 6 deaths in this movie. My review of the film. One thing that I think has helped this movie is time and the sense of nostalgia. I hadn't been on the planet for that long when the movie came out, so I don't truly know how it was perceived during the time, but I know for a fact it launched the careers of the likes of Freddie Prinze Jr., Sarah Michelle Gellar, and Jennifer Love Hewitt, making them staple names and elevating them to heights that they weren't at before. In terms of comparing this to other slasher movies, it's not as iconic as the likes of Scream, which was also written by Jim Williamson, who wrote this movie. But even though it didn't reach those levels, when it came to creating a franchise of movies, I think in its own right, this movie did a good job. The timing probably didn't help because it followed on shortly after the success of Scream. When it comes to digesting this movie, the runtime helped it massively, with it only being around 1 hour 40, and it was just a very easy movie to burn through and follow whilst watching it. The jump scares in I Know What You Did Last Summer are quite minimal in terms of quantity, but what I will tell you is that they're very effective. The score definitely helps, and the one that got me the most was when Missy appeared in front of the window of the car. Honestly, my hands were jolting around and everything. It did a good job at luring us into the conversation and the emotion that Julie had, and then, bam, it just got me. So in that sense, this movie definitely nailed the jump scares. One thing that I really wanted to talk about with this movie though was the score. Even though this movie was made in the mid to late 90s, it felt like it had that old school horror backdrop due to the score that John Debney put at the heart of it. Without the music that featured in this movie, I don't think the effect would have been felt in the slightest, so I was really impressed with it because it genuinely transported me there. The descending piano, the strings that would play, and even the silence. He just knew when to allow the scene to breathe and when to bring in that instant dynamic change in sound, which would just make me jump. When it comes to the performances in the movie, they're all pretty solid. The main cast deliver, but knowing the careers that they had, it's clear to see that. With regards to Ben Willis being the villain and his performance, I thought it was okay. The delivery was a tad stale, and it would have been nicer if the performance was stronger, considering we'd waited the entirety of the movie for the reveal, but that's something that we've just got to deal with. As in all slasher movies, there are things that you have to turn a blind eye to, and this movie is no exception from that. For example, the killer seems to transport to wherever he needed to be. He had loads of plot armor that just allowed him to enter properties and go undetected, despite the fact that this dude was probably over 6 foot and was quite well built. Plus, he never really took any devastating damage either, but it wouldn't be a true slasher without it, right? Oh, and he also survived and became the killer in the sequel, so yeah, this guy was pretty invincible. I'd say that when it comes to the deeper theme of the movie, that's something that does get a little bit lost in the plot. There's the theme of what guilt can do to a person in the likes of Julie, and how she went from a top performer in her class to being on her last warning with the dean because she couldn't think about anything else. But with regards to the rest of the group, they were all pretty okay and were just acting like nothing ever happened. I would have liked to have seen the guilt paralyzing them a little bit more, and then just seeing how their lives changed and how they lived it differently for a year, all for nothing, because the person that they hit and disposed the body of didn't actually end up dying. All in all, I think this is probably becoming a bit of a classic horror movie in the sense that if you're inviting a bunch of pals round to watch a horror movie that you don't have to pay too much attention to, but you know you're all going to enjoy, this is the one that I'd say to stick on. I think it captures the time really well. It has a solid villain, and you're left wondering who the killer could truly be the entire time that it's building to Ben's reveal. It's summertime now, so stick it on and remember what you did this summer, next year. So, there you have it, the ending explained to I Know What You Did Last Summer. If you want to see the most recent movie being broken down, then be sure to subscribe, because as soon as it comes out, I'll be covering it. What did you think of the original? Share your thoughts in the comments. As always, thanks for tuning into the video, and I'll see you in the next one.